A global perspective now. Bill Frelick has visited refugee sites around the world. Previously, he headed the U.S. Committee for Refugees. He's now the director of the Refugee Rights Program for Human Rights Watch, and he spoke to me from Toronto. Given the movement of hundreds of millions of people across the globe now, I'm interested to know from a human rights perspective how you would describe this situation.
Well, migrations have been part of human history since the beginning. Think of the Garden of Eden, think of the Exodus from Egypt in the Bible. But we are looking at unprecedented numbers of people now, and a reluctance on the part of many receiving states to allow people into their countries and to narrow the definition of who qualifies for protection. And that, I think, does change the dynamics that we're looking at in terms of protecting people who are fleeing from persecution, war, and other existential threats, really.
I mean, one would think that over time, in fact, the idea of who deserves protection is an evolving thing, given, the global situation. How would you, there are laws around that, but how is it changing?
Well, in some ways it's devolving rather than evolving. The 1951 Refugee Convention defined refugees as people fleeing a well-founded fear of being persecuted on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, social group, and political opinion. Over time, that's expanded to include people fleeing indiscriminate violence from armed conflict, and in the case law in the United States and Canada and other jurisdictions, looking at people fleeing gang violence, for example, in Central America, or domestic violence, whose governments are unwilling or unable to protect them, and that's a very important element of the definition, are people who have no place where they can go within their own country to be protected, and their own governments are not protecting them, and so they are forced really to flee and to seek protection outside of their own countries. And this is an area that's become particularly controversial. In the United States, up until recently, the Attorney General, Sessions, actually put a directive to the immigration courts to tell them not to accept people that are fleeing from gang violence in Central America in this sort of way, and not to include them as people who would be protected in the United States. And that's of great concern because there are a lot of people who maybe don't fit what seems to be the definition from 1951, but when you look at them and you look at the threats against their lives and you recognize that they really had no choice and are fleeing direct threats, these are people who really do need protection and they don't have any other options.
At the same time, and the caravan that's coming through Mexico at this point is, in global terms, a pretty small number. But if you look at the mass migrations that we've seen into Europe, out of Syria, into Lebanon and Turkey, and the migrations in Africa, it's hard to imagine any government that, in fact, would be equipped to deal with that kind of mass migration.
Certainly you look at Lebanon, and they've had more than 1 million Syrian refugees coming into the country, which represents about 1/4 of its total population. Bangladesh, which has all kinds of problems with population density and rising sea levels, they were confronted with 700,000 plus Rohingya refugees over a course of a few weeks that came in last year. But in both cases, those governments have done a reasonably good job of keeping their borders open, of recognizing that they do have obligations under refugee law, whether it's customary law, because neither of them is actually a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but they've basically respected refugee rights. It's been very difficult for them, and they've gotten precious little support from the international community in many cases, but they've managed these large flows of people. And then you see a country like the United States or Australia, countries that have relatively small numbers of refugees coming that say that it's an invasion, to quote the President of the United States, and to exaggerate and to create what looks like a threat and create a frenzy, really, of xenophobia in reaction to something that's actually quite manageable and which a government like the United States certainly has the capacity to manage.
But if you look at, for example, even if you say, you know, Bangladesh has done a pretty good job in terms of accommodating the Rohingya, the situation in Lebanon is pretty good. That doesn't sound like a long-term solution. I mean, how do we need to change our thinking? How do governments need to change their thinking?
Right. I mean, refugee protection is really an interim step. It's what do you do until a solution is found? So as the notion of asylum is really, it's not the panacea. It's basically a holding pattern in many respects. Now, over time, you have protracted situations, and you have to think about how refugees progressively can gain more rights and eventually integrate into other societies if it's impossible for them to return home. The preference is certainly that people should be able to repatriate, but the conditions have to be met for that. You take the Rohingya refugees, for example. They experienced brutal ethnic cleansing. And the idea that they could just return after a matter of months or even a year or so, if the situation in the country of origin, in Burma, in Myanmar, isn't addressed in a way that actually talks about why they fled in the first place. And for them, it's statelessness, it's a lack of identity of their Rohingya nationality, it's the lack of justice for the crimes that were committed against them, and still no resolution of the underlying conflict. And so you need to meet those preconditions. Once those conditions are met, then yes, we can talk about voluntary repatriation. But that's a tall order, and truly addressing the root causes of refugee flows has proven to be extremely challenging. Think Somalia, think Afghanistan, you know, any number of these places that for decades have had failed governments and have conflicts that seem to morph from one cause to another, but nevertheless make it impossible for many of the refugees to return.
In Western countries, we've watched the rise of nationalism, concerns about sovereignty, and really when you look at, for example, in Europe, it's, as you point out, it's unlikely that many of those people seeking asylum or moving across those borders would likely return home. How do you address that? How do you address the political reality?
The political reality is tough, and a lot of times human rights is not the popular approach. But there are obligations, and we try to tell people, you know, put yourself in the shoes of that refugee. Try to understand that these are not people that were choosing to leave their countries. There was hardly any migratory movement out of Syria until 2011. And then you had, 5 million refugees in the region. You had twice that number of people internally displaced. And even within the region, most of those people stayed in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon for the next 4 or 5 years. It wasn't until they were beginning to see that the prospects of return were fading, they were losing hope, and their conditions of asylum in those 3 countries were becoming increasingly precarious. And at that point, they began what would be called the secondary movement, the secondary migration into Europe. And in part, I think, looking for a more sustainable future, in many cases for their children. Thinking about their kids basically not being able to go to school in those countries of first asylum, and wanting a future for their children. And let's not discount the possibility that if peace somehow is reached in Syria, that people may go back, and if they do go back, you want them to have skills, you want them to have education that they can bring back with them to help rebuild their country.
Mr. Frelick, thank you very much for your perspective on this.
Okay, my pleasure.